For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the House suspend the rules and pass House Res 676.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 676, resolution supporting the rights of the people of Iran to free expression, condemning the Iranian regime for its crackdown on legitimate protest and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Ross-Layton, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I might consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I appreciate it, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for their swift action in putting this important and timely resolution together. The world has been witnessing the people of Iran taking to the streets en masse to protest the radical regime in Tehran. They have made it clear that the regime's policies have done nothing but harm. We've seen large-scale protests in Iran before, most notably in 2009, but these protests are different, Mr. Speaker. This time, unlike in 2009, America has not shied away from doing the right thing. The administration has expressed vocal support for the people of Iran, and it has warned the regime that we are watching how it responds. The public's discontent is palpable, and these protests have exposed the cracks behind the regime's veneer. For decades, the hardline regime has squandered Iran's vast resources in pursuit of spreading the revolutionary ideology and of achieving an illicit nuclear weapons program. The regimes rule by fear, rule by intimidation. The human rights abuses, the silencing of the opposition, the abuses of ethnic and religious minorities, the restrictions imposed against women under Sharia law, and the corruption. None of these are being taken anymore, sitting down by millions of Iranians. And let us not be fooled, Mr. Speaker. Rouhani is no moderate. He is an opportunist. He's a lifelong adherent to the regime and its hateful ideology. That is why this resolution is so important. We must make it clear that we truly support the people of Iran and their aspirations for a free and democratic society. Their protests are a referendum on the regime, and we must make it clear to all the regime officials that they will be held accountable for any human rights abuses in response to these protests. But, Mr. Speaker, we must also not lose sight of the bigger picture. These protests are important, and it is important that we take action on human rights abuses. But this is just one aspect of the regime's illicit behavior, and sanctions against human rights violators is but one tool that we have at our disposal. The totality of the regime's nefarious and illicit activity is what the people of Iran are protesting against. And it would be unwise for us to lose focus of that bigger picture. So while it is important that we stand here today in support of the people of Iran, and we make it clear that there will be consequences for human rights abuses, we must make sure that we see the whole board here and connect the dots. And that means, Mr. Speaker, using all the tools at our disposal, because they are not isolated issues. They are all connected. So with that, I would urge my colleagues to support this resolution and to continue supporting a strong response to all of Iran's illicit activity and the use of all of the tools that we have at our disposal. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in support of this bill and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
In this House, we are on both sides of the Iran nuclear deal, but we were united in knowing that Iran is not an ally of the United States, at least the Islamic Republic of Iran is not, and this House never agreed to ignore extreme human rights abuses simply because the government of Iran has agreed to limitations on its nuclear program. This resolution puts us on the right side of history by stating that the House of Representatives stands with the people of Iran and condemns the Iranian regime's serious human rights abuses. And it goes on to encourage the administration to expedite the licensing of communications technology to entities in Iran to improve the ability of the Iranian people to speak freely, and also calls on companies around the world not to sell this regime any device, any technology that will allow it to cut the Iranian people from the social media and from other communications platforms. We have seen in Iran a people dedicated to democracy, dedicated to improving their own lives. But over 1,000 Iranians have been arrested. At least 24 have been killed. This in a country with a great history. The Cyrus Cylinder is perhaps the first human rights document in world history, and a model of it stands in the United Nations to commemorate the dedication of the Iranian people to human rights. Today they shout, "No Gaza, no Lebanon, no Syria, my life for Iran," because they know that this regime's involvement in supporting terrorism around the world has not only devastated Syria, where Assad clings to power and 500,000 people have died, not only brings death and destruction to Lebanon and Yemen, but it has also devastated the Iranian economy, because this regime insists upon supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi, and those are only the terrorist regimes whose names begin with H. And of course, this regime has killed over 5,000 members of the LGBT community solely for who they are and whom they love. This is a regime whose human rights record should indeed be criticized by the formal adoption of a resolution by this House of Representatives. I also want to point out that the travel ban or Muslim ban implemented by this administration is harming our efforts to support the Iranian people at this time of crisis, because it says that if leaders of these demonstrations want to come to my community, where they have tens and tens of thousands of Iranian American supporters, they can't do it. And if, God forbid, they fear for their lives and want to flee, even if they're carefully vetted, they cannot set foot on American soil. So I look forward to us standing with the people of Iran and eliminating the Muslim ban. And I look forward to this House saying that we stand with the people who are putting their lives on the line to fight for democracy. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Europe and Emerging Threats.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much. I rise today in support of H.R. 676, which puts America squarely on the side of courageous Iranians who risk their lives in opposition to the corruption and oppression of the mullah regime in Tehran. Iran is a country made up of oppressed minorities. Kurds, there are more Kurds in Iran than there are in Iraq. The Baluch, the Azaris, and yes, Arabs, and yes, anti-clerical Persians. These people have lived under a regime that terrorizes the population, their population, into submission and supports terrorist attacks on other nations. Unlike our last president, who closed his ears to the pleas of the Iranian oppressed and brutalized peoples, and also, I might add, facilitated the transfer of billions of dollars to that regime in the name of an arms control agreement. No, that president is gone, and our new president is making us proud today by endorsing the rights of those who are struggling for freedom and putting our country and our people squarely on the side of those people who share our values in freedom and justice throughout the world.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Florida. Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished member of the Brad Caucus, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the bipartisan resolution, Resolution 676, offered by my friends Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Eliot Engel of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I want to thank my friend from Florida, my friend from California for leading us in this conversation today. Less than 2 weeks ago, on December 28th, protests began in towns and villages throughout Iran. These quickly and organically grew to become the largest anti-government demonstrations the country has witnessed since those remarkable demonstrations in the summer of 2009. Iranian citizens have taken to the streets to decry the regime's corruption, economic mismanagement, and destabilizing activities abroad, including support for such groups, terrorist groups as Hezbollah. The Iranian people, the good men and women seeking relief from the failings of the current regime, deserve our support. Their voices deserve to be heard. Not surprisingly, the response of the regime in Tehran to these protests have been predictably draconian. News reports suggest dozens of Iranians have been killed. In the crackdown on protesters, more than 1,000 Iranians have been arrested. In an effort to silence the protesters, the Iranian government has blocked access to social media platforms used to organize and spread the word of the demonstrations. This most recent crackdown is part of a long history of human rights abuses by the Iranian government, both at home and throughout the violent repression, and abroad through funding of groups who support terror. Mr. Speaker, I am proud that last month the House passed my amendment to the Iranian Leadership Asset Transparency Act to help crack down on the Iranian human rights abusers and to ensure U.S. sanctions are best positioned to improve the human rights situation in Iran. This is but one step. We need to do more to stop Iran's repression and persecution of different religious faiths, including Sunni Muslims, Christians, and Baha'is. We need to do more to stop the Iranian regime's arbitrary and unlawful killings, and we must do more to protect the Iranian people's right to freedom of expression. And I have 2 seconds, 15 seconds.
Gentleman, 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 additional seconds.
This resolution is an opportunity for the American people to stand with the peaceful Iranian protesters and condemn the malign activities of the oppressive Iranian regime. In the days ahead, I urge this administration to hold the Iranian regime accountable to its international human rights obligations, as well as work with our allies at the United Nations to condemn and sanction Iran for its ongoing human rights violations. The government in Iran is seeking to silence its people. Today's resolution shows we are watching and that we stand with the people of Iran. I urge my colleagues to support this important resolution, and I thank my colleague Brad Sherman for the extra time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California. Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Operations.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I rise today in strong support of HRES 676 in solidarity with the people of Iran, who courageously took to the streets in recent weeks to protest their country's barbaric dictatorship. I want to thank my good friends Ed Royce and Eliot Engel for their leadership in bringing this resolution to the floor. And I want to thank Chairwoman Emeritus for her tremendous work over the years towards Iran and trying to get a policy that respects fundamental human rights and also ends their barbaric reign of terror and their terrorism. Mr. Speaker, over the past several weeks, tens of thousands of Iranians participated in nationwide protests to condemn the corruption, repression, and brutality that together represent the unique legacy of Iran's nearly 40-year-old theocracy. The regime responded with characteristic coercion, intimidating activists and their families, and deploying government-sponsored thugs and military units to quell the unrest. Approximately 20 protesters died in clashes with security forces. At least 1,000 people were arrested, and I'm sure those 1,000 are being tortured as we meet here today, and some estimates place the number closer to 4,000 people. This unrest is the inevitable consequence of a dictatorship built on brutality and corruption in the service of domestic repression and regional hegemony. Ambassador Haley was absolutely right when she told the UN Security Council, when the rights of people are denied, the people rightly resist. If the concerns are not acknowledged, then peace and security are inevitably threatened. I am very proud of the work that Congress has done over the years. In my subcommittee, we've held hearings on human rights abuses in China and Iran, including with Pastor Saeed Abedini, who did a tremendous job, his wife trying to effectuate his release. But we must hold Iran to account for the treatment of hundreds of jailed protesters and not let their fates be forgotten with the next news cycle. We must work tirelessly to secure the liberty of citizens, our own citizens, including Shuwei Wang, a graduate student from my home state of New Jersey, who has spent the past 519 days in Evin Prison Complex. Again, I urge support for the bill.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Sir, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, a member of our committee, Mr. Swazi.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The people live like paupers while the mullahs live like gods. The people live like paupers while the mullahs live like gods. For weeks, tens of thousands of brave Iranians have courageously stood up in over 70 cities and chanted, "The people live like paupers while the mullahs live like gods." They challenge their failed government. They've done so in the face of violent repression, imprisonment, torture, and even death. Why? Because they're fed up. Fed up with poverty and unemployment. Fed up with economic deprivation and rampant corruption. Fed up with an oppressive theocratic regime that mismanages their own country, mistreats its own people, and spends billions of dollars sowing the seeds of war and funding terrorists while their people suffer. The Ayatollahs recklessly pursued nuclear weapons instead of creating jobs and building infrastructure for their own people. The regime's apologists have long argued that these policies are popular, that they give Iranians a national sense of pride, restoring their place as a regional power. A regional power? More like regional thugs. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias have executed and beat civilians and looted homes and destroyed people's lives. In Lebanon, Iranian-backed Hezbollah aims tens of thousands of rockets at Israeli citizens. And in Syria, backs Bashar al-Assad's vicious regime. Iran sends weapons and money to militants in Yemen and Bahrain and Gaza. It has become the biggest purveyor of mayhem in the Middle East, pouring billions of dollars into nefarious activities while their own people are impoverished. Today, I rise with my colleagues to support the Iranian protesters and the bipartisan House Resolution 676. The United States and our allies should use the menu of sanctions available to us to target human rights violators and the Ayatollah's thugs who forcefully repress their fellow citizens. We must ensure that the protesters have access to social media, and we must let them know that we support them. The Ayatollahs must know that the free world is watching. The people live like paupers while the mullahs live like gods. The time has come for the people to rise up and change it. Thank you, Brad.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm so pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, who is the chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security, as well as a senior member on the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of this resolution condemning the Iranian regime's crackdown on legitimate protest and to show the world that America stands with the Iranian people who want peace, prosperity, and freedom. For many years, we have known the regime in Iran has fueled radicalism and violence across the Middle East as the world's leading state sponsor of terror. But over the last few weeks, we have seen the brutal tactics Iran's leaders are willing to take to silence protesters who are fed up with the extremism, corruption, and incompetence coming from their capital. The protesters deserve to have their voices heard without fear of retaliation. And today, Iranians are not citizens who are free to choose their own destinies. They are subjects to a fanatical dictatorship that fears the people it rules by denying their freedoms. Sadly, the Obama administration believed that the Ayatollah and his radical clerics would be willing partners for peace in a very naive strategy to reward them with billions of dollars in sanction relief. It is clear, however, that since the signing of the flawed Iran deal, the regime's behavior has only gotten worse by continuing its support for terror groups like Hezbollah and its cracking down and backing of the Houthi rebels in Yemen, all in pursuit of establishing the Shia Crescent. Fortunately, the current administration and this Congress will not be so easily fooled or complicit in their foreign adventurism. Leaders of rogue states will say whatever they must to bring unearned concessions from great powers. But if it is real change that is desired, we must apply more pressure. We cannot trust a country's government to be a peaceful one with other nations if it resorts to violence against its own people it is supposed to protect. And that is why just this morning I will introduce legislation that requires the Trump administration to determine whether senior members of the government of Iran are responsible or complicit in human rights abuses, corruption, or censorship. The bill also calls out the Iranian regime's practice of taking American citizens.
I'd like to yield an additional 30 seconds to Mr. McCall.
Gentleman's yield an additional 30 seconds.
Thank the gentlelady from Florida. The bill also calls out the Iranian regime's practice of taking American citizens and other foreign nationals hostage and laying out several steps the administration should take in conjunction with our allies to put an end to this practice. A time will come when the tyrants of Tehran are held accountable for their actions. And after many decades of authoritarian rule, Iranians deserve to be free. And when democracy finally does flourish in Iran, the people will remember who stood by their side. So I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Mr. Deutsch is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the past couple of weeks, tens of thousands of Iranian citizens from a broad cross-section of society took to the streets to demand accountability and change in their country. This was the largest mass protest since the Green Revolution in 2009. Tragically, both ended with the same predictable darkness. Harsh government crackdowns in which innocent, peaceful protesters were arrested, were jailed, and were killed. In the latest episode, more than 3,700 Iranian protesters were arrested, nearly 24 were killed. The Iranian people deserve better, and they deserve the support of all peoples who value and yearn for freedom. Today's resolution sends an important message to the Iranian people that we stand with them in their legitimate pursuit of reforms from a regime that would silence their voices and steal their fundamental liberties. I also believe we should do more. So I'm proud to have introduced with Chairman McCall, along with the support of Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act that goes one step further than condemnation to actually impose sanctions against those Iranian officials perpetrating these egregious human rights violations, as well as those responsible for kidnapping Americans like my own constituent, Bob Levinson, who has now spent more than 10 years in captivity. Last week, we welcomed in a new year, and Bob's family again ushered in that new year without Bob by their side. For his sake, and for the sake of the Iranian people trying to hold their own regime accountable for caring more about Assad and Hamas than they do about helping their own citizens, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on House Resolution 676, help bring the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act to the floor, and let's make sure that human rights remain exactly where they should in American foreign policy, right at the center of our agenda. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade, who tells it just like it is.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady. Make no doubt about it, Mr. Speaker, the #1 terrorist in the world is the Ayatollah in charge of the butchery against his own people in Iran. He's the #1 guy, the most wanted man in the world, as far as I'm concerned, for terrorism, lies at his feet. He, along with the mullahs of Iran, continue to crack down violently on the people of Iran that are exercising a human right to protest the government that is in charge. The regime's brutality against its people knows no limit. The silence of their crimes in Iran has blocked much of the internet and social media, including the Telegram and Instagram, the silence of the crimes of the Ayatollah. We must make sure that this important line of communication stays open for the Iranian people. In 2009, there were about 1 million folks in Iran that had access to social media. Now there are about 20 million people, I understand, have access to social media. Our administration must make sure that the American businesses and technology are still available to allow the Iranian people to document the regime's crimes against the people. The Iranian people can bring about change on their own, but we must help by providing necessary tools to empower democratic movements that the mullahs stand in fear of. Mr. Speaker, in 2009, the Iranians rose up against the mullahs, but our government merely watched the arena of freedom in the streets of Iran while our government sat in the stands as a spectator. This is not a spectator sport. This is about freedom and human dignity. The United States must politically, publicly, and economically support the people of Iran and let them know we will not be in the stands as a spectator any longer. And we must penalize the mullahs and the Ayatollah economically for their crimes. And that's just the way it is. I'll yield back to the gentlelady, or the gentleman now.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Let me thank both gentlemen from California for their leadership and for their very important work on a very important crisis fight for human rights and freedom. Just yesterday, I rose to the floor of the House to recount my experience over the weekend joining the Iranian American community in Houston on a busy corner at Post Oak and Westheimer, where we joined together as Americans to begin to articulate that there is no divide when it comes to the freedom of speech, freedom for all to have access to protests and democracy. So today I rise to support HRES 676, and I rise to speak in horror of the 1,000 Iranians that have been arrested and almost 24 killed. We mourn their loss, but we recognize that it has to be all of us, our allies included, that must stand and join in the language of this resolution. And it is, of course, to ensure that sanctions are pointedly targeted those who want to oppress the protesters. Interestingly enough, the protesters are now from rural and the middle class. The questions of the economy are very much a part of it, that Iranians are not able to live, to be able to have economic opportunity. Their young people have no growth. And so this is far-reaching, which is, of course, surprising to the regime. They were hoping to quash this. They have no answers. And the answers should be a concerted, committed, and dedicated group of allies, including the United States, leading an effort, the support for these protesters. So I rise today to join in standing with the people of Iran in their legitimate and peaceful protests. I ask that the regime be condemned, and I ask that the communications, Mr. Speaker, be allowed to continue, and that our companies
His time has expired.
I yield the gentlelady 30 more seconds.
Gentleladies yield an additional 30 seconds.
I thank the Speaker for his kind limited tap, and I thank the manager for his 30 seconds. I believe it is so important that the communications, the work that we're getting ready to do here in the United States to provide communications technology needs to go forward, but we must include in our petition, meaning our petition as members of Congress, that our companies do not deny or quash the rights of Iranians to communicate with each other for peace, freedom, and democracy. And our message to the regime is, it is time to open the doors of freedom in Iran, and Iranian Americans, the United States Congress, and of course all of our government stand for peace, freedom, dignity, and democracy for the people of Iran. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to yield the remainder of my time to Chairman Royce and ask that he be able to control that time.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Royce is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, today we stand with the people of Iran. We stand with people who are engaged in legitimate protests against an oppressive, corrupt regime. And there's a certain irony to this. This is a great people, the people of Iran. It was the Persian king Cyrus the Great who drafted the first Declaration of Human Rights, the Cyrus Cylinder. As you enter the United Nations, you see this quotation from him. This was a document meant to protect other cultures, and it secured a special place in the history of civilization. His humanitarian values that he laid out of freedom for all peoples, respect for culture, for religious liberty, recognition of the fact that it is better to be loved than be feared, these are remarkable attributes, especially at that point in time, and they were handed down as part of this deep Persian culture. And we who live in free societies owe a great debt to the Iranian people. They're the heirs to this culture. They are those who hold those values and ideas for governance that originally inspired the European Enlightenment, leaders of our own government here, our own founding fathers. It was Thomas Jefferson who told his grandson, "These are the ideals you study first of Cyrus the Great in terms of governance." Now, it is amazing that Iranians at this moment enjoy far fewer rights than their forefathers did. Cyrus was lauded for the protections he offered religious and ethnic minorities. We look at the state of affairs today, and you see the repression of Iran's ethnic and religious minority populations, from the Azerbaijanis to the Baluchs, from the Kurds and the Arabs to the Baha'is and the Christians and the Zoroastrians. You know, the regime authorities routinely deny those citizens the most basic human rights, and they do it through harassment and intimidation and detention and violence. And if you want to know what kind of violence, talk to the young Persians or talk to the young minorities who have suffered through the torture in those prisons. Why do they suffer through it? Because they are trying to bring attention to the oppressiveness of that regime. And those young people yearn for human rights. They stand for the celebrated culture of the Persian people and for human rights. And as this resolution makes clear, the United States House of Representatives fully supports those who have taken to the streets in Iran to exercise the fundamental freedom of expression and assembly. We join them in the hope that their bravery will build the foundation for the emergence of a freely elected, open, democratic political system in Iran. It is a moral imperative to support those who risk their lives demanding the freedoms that people in free societies enjoy every day. And that's why this resolution calls on all democratic governments and institutions worldwide to join us in clearly supporting the Iranian people's right to live in a free society. We all face a clear choice, and we stand with the protesters. We stand with those who demand the basic rights and opportunities enjoyed in free societies. We're not going to stand with the oppressors, those who steal the wealth of a great nation to enrich themselves and to fund violence abroad. Supporting the people of Iran is a strategic imperative. These brave men and women are standing up against the Revolutionary Guard's violent intervention in Syria and Lebanon as well. We must join them in demanding an end to the single greatest source of instability in the Middle East, and this is this obsession that the regime has with this ideology. In standing with the Iranian people, we must explain that they are not the target of our sanctions. U.S. sanctions target the oppressive, destabilizing regime, not the people of Iran. And that's why, as this resolution makes clear, Congress has provided authority to license communications technology that improves the ability of the Iranian people to speak freely. Today, we call on the agencies involved to expedite those licenses. U.S. international broadcasting must also turn up the volume of its efforts in Iran and convey a message of hope and support. And this should be conveyed by the young that know that this debate today in the American People's House is about this issue. Iranians must know that they are not alone in their struggle for freedom. And we also call on companies to reject requests by the regime to cut off the Iranian people from social media. These technologies are at their best when they are used to empower people and undermine the efforts of oppressive regimes. There's more we can do, and I welcome Chairman McCall and Congressman Deutsch's introduction of bipartisan legislation that will give the administration greater leverage to target those responsible for ordering and carrying out human rights abuses in Iran. And this includes the regime's practice of holding Americans and other foreigners hostage. Many of the regime's hostages are people of Iranian descent who came to visit family members, came to visit loved ones. I'm also working to introduce legislation that has the same goal as those who have bravely taken to the streets, to push the corrupt Revolutionary Guard out of the Iranian economy. And in doing so, it seeks to deny the guards the funds they use to hold power over the Iranian people while destabilizing Syria and destabilizing Lebanon. Mr. Speaker, Congress and the administration have a great opportunity. We must work together on an approach to Iran that empowers the Iranian people and targets the corrupt regime which oppresses a great people. We cannot be quiet. With the passage of this resolution, we state that America stands with the Iranian people. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I commend our committee chairman for an outstanding speech, and I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise today as a proud co-sponsor of H.Res. 676 to urge support for this bipartisan resolution to help stop terror. I want to thank Chairman Royce and my good friend, Ranking Member Elliot Engel, for their leadership on this issue, and I'm glad that this bipartisan resolution has proceeded swiftly to a vote on the House floor. Mr. Speaker, the revolution of 1979 marked an enormous step backwards for global security and for the basic rights of the Iranian people, the longest-suffering victims of this corrupt terrorist regime. From its very beginnings, the Islamic Republic of Iran, under the control of its supreme leaders, has repeatedly violated fundamental human rights of its own citizens. In August, the UN Special Reporter on the situation of human rights in Iran highlighted the Khamenei regime's many ongoing abuses, including the arbitrary detention, quote, arbitrary detention and prosecution of individuals for their legitimate exercise of a broad range of rights, the persecution of human rights defenders, journalists, students, trade union leaders, and artists, a high level of executions, including of juvenile offenders, the use of torture and ill treatment, widespread violations of the right to a fair trial and due process of law, especially before revolutionary courts, and a high level of discrimination against women and religious and ethnic minorities. Beginning late last month, protesters across the country have taken to the streets to decry their dismal economic prospects, Iran's costly, aggressive, and destabilizing actions throughout the region, and an anti-democratic regime that stifles their rights and aspirations and supports terror. These brave men and women engaged in peaceful demonstrations have every right to demand change from their corrupt and oppressive terrorist government. While Iranians live under a brutal authoritarian democracy at home, their governments insist on bankrolling terror throughout the region. Iran has capitalized on sanctions relief, bolstering its arsenal of conventional arms and its illegal ballistic missiles program, and increasing the funding of heinous terrorist organizations and proxies in Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq, as well as propping up the murderous regime of Assad in Syria. As the world's leading sponsor of terror, Iran provides more than $800 million annually to Hezbollah and recently renewed its support for Hamas. Iranian-backed forces are also attempting to gain a foothold in Syria, right up against Israel's border, to threaten our vital ally and the leading democracy in the region. There should be nothing partisan about having the backs of brave men and women everywhere or anywhere who risk death to speak out for what is right and against a terrorist regime. The bipartisan resolution condemns the regime's censorship, violent crackdowns, and systematic repression. We must send a clear message to Iran that its destructive behavior throughout the Middle East will not be tolerated. Mr. Speaker, the time has come for the people of Iran to enjoy their fundamental right to a peaceful and democratic government. I urge each of my colleagues to join me in supporting this bipartisan resolution to help stop terror. And I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields
I
back
yield
the balance of his
1
time.
minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Simple things mean a lot. That's why I, too, stand in support of House Resolution 676, which sends a clear message that the United States strongly condemns the arrest of peaceful protesters by the rogue Iranian regime. The Iranian people, Mr. Speaker, deserve to be free. The last administration witnessed such protests about 8 years ago and turned their back. And the world saw that America turned their back on the freedom effort and movement in Iran. The current administration has noticed immediately and recognized immediately, and we are here today, too, to say that no longer will terrorism be appeased. No longer should we help pay for the funding of Hezbollah and Hamas through payments in the Iran nuclear deal. Simple things mean a lot, and simple things like this resolution, Mr. Speaker, mean that we stand with the Iranian people who breathe and live to be free, just like we do. With that, I yield.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I will continue to reserve.
Gentleman from California continues to reserve. The gentleman, the chairman of the committee, is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to Ambassador Ann Wagner, member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for demonstrating that the House of Representatives stands with the people of Iran and condemns the country's brutal regime. I rise today to applaud the Iranian people who are struggling for dignity, human rights, and economic security under a shadow of oppression. We are a hemisphere away, but our hearts are with the brave men and women who are raising their voices in hopes that they will finally be free from the reigns of tyranny. The Iranian people are protesting the abuses of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and we must support their outrage by severely punishing and containing the IRGC with suffocating sanctions. We must work with our allies to help Iranians communicate on the internet without restrictions. We must broadcast footage from protesters and hold authorities accountable for abuses. America is an enthusiastic friend of the Iranian people. We are thrilled to support their aspirations for justice and liberty, and we stand with them as they take to the streets and demand an end to oppression. I thank you.
The lady from Missouri has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to yield 1 minute of my time to the gentleman from California and ask that he be able to control that time.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I continue to reserve.
Yield a minute to Mr. Zeldin, member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, from New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in favor of your resolution demonstrating our support for the Iranian people's cry for democracy. On December 28, 2017, tens of thousands of Iranians courageously poured into the streets to protest the brutality of President Rouhani's regime. Instead of caring for its own people, the Iranian regime focuses all of its energy on suffocating their cry, murdering protesters while choking off communication via the internet and social media apps. We've been down this road before. This is our second chance. The Iranian people, smothered by their own government, look to us, and instead of the chill of silence this time, they're rightfully met with the full, immediate, and resounding support of the United States. we stand in solidarity with the millions of Iranians desperate for support to help them turn the tide in Tehran and all throughout Iran. And the people of Iran will be losing a great champion with the retirement of Chairman Royce, who has served over the course of the last 3 terms as chairman of our committee. The fight continues. I support this resolution. I yield back.
The gentleman has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized.
New reserve.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, has the only time remaining.
We don't have any time remaining. We have no time
California is
remaining.
recognized. Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized.
This is a bipartisan resolution. It will put America and this Congress on the side of the Iranian people. Regardless of which side you are on as to the nuclear deal, we are all dedicated to peace and democracy in Iran and an end to its support for terrorism around the world, support that not only causes damage outside Iran's borders, but as the demonstrators shouting in over 50 Iranian cities have clearly indicated, devastates the economy of Iran. To us here in Washington, we may believe that the face of this regime is that of Foreign Minister Zarif, the dapper, debonair diplomat, meeting with us in Geneva and Vienna. But the real face of this regime is that of Alan Kurdi, that 3-year-old Syrian Kurdish child, washed up onto the beach in Turkey after fleeing the war in Syria, a war that has claimed nearly 500,000 lives because and only because Assad has been propped up by the Iranian regime. And the other face of this regime are the real faces of Iranian protesters who put their lives on the line for the freedom of their country. So this is a bill that deserves the support of both sides of the aisle, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California has yielded back his time, all time having now expired. On this debate, on this legislation, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 676? Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from California.
on that, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed.